School is out, and it's time that everybody finally gets to get their family together and go camping and hiking and all of the fun family festivities that you can do out in nature. But not every story is the run-of-the-mill, hunky-dory good time. Some of these trips yield tales of terror. These 10 people share their most terrifying stories deep within the woods with their families. One more thing before we get into these stories. The first story is going to be an animated collaboration I did with Strawberry Nightmare on her channel. It's a pretty creepy story and I hope you enjoy it. If you liked her animation, please give her channel a subscribe. You can find that link in the description below. Let's get into the stories. I thought the scraping sound I'd been hearing inside the walls was just rats. I didn't think much of it. My house was old and wooden, located by a small forest. Bugs and vermin were a bit of a given, but I bought the place at such a low price, it seemed almost a desperate plea for someone to take it off the realtor's hands. I put traps around the house, sprinkled rat poison in pods, even had pest control stop by. The scratching continued weeks later. I ignored it the best I could. That slow scraping in the boards. Every night, the sound of something raking its claws along the insides of my home traveled in the air. Almost similar to a knife sliding along a cutting board. The scratching would travel from room to room, taking its time to make sure nothing went untouched. Finally, it would start directly behind the headboard of my bed, a dragging that made me grit my teeth. Even still, I pretended nothing was wrong, until one morning I awoke to a frenzied scratching in my living room, interspersed with loud thuds. This was accompanied by a panicked wailing, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I skipped calling animal control. I phoned the police instead. It didn't take long to find the issue. They pulled a small boy out of the wall as I stared in shock. He was covered in dirt with wild eyes that twitched with each shake of his body. I explained to the officer I thought it was rats that had been pestering me for weeks. Luckily, he believed me. I called to check on the boy later that day. There wasn't much to tell. He'd been delusional from hunger and panic. I was amazed he hadn't been affected by any attempts to get rid of what I thought were rats. He was able to speak, but it hadn't made much sense to anyone. He was convinced there was a thing in the walls that had kept him there. He said it needed him because it had been hungry. Everyone thought he was been hallucinating. I felt sorry for him, but glad I could finally rest. That night, I went to bed without a sense of dread. Things were okay, and my phone rang out in the silence. I answered. When I heard the shouts of the officer of the line, from what my brain could piece together, they found out the boy's relatives after calling around. He'd recently been reported missing. He'd only been gone for 2 days. There was no possible way he could have been making those sounds for as long as I had been hearing them. He wasn't the cause. Then, neither were rats. Fear seized my chest as the sound of scratching, slow and taunting, began in the wall beside my head. Back in 1994, in the winter, sometime in February in Michigan, I was a freshman in high school. My cousin had just got his driver's license recently. He was a year ahead of me in school, in the 10th grade. This was a few months before I was getting my driver's license. My cousin worked at this gas station and got off work at 8 p.m. We used to go on doobie cruises. I smoke weed and just drive around. Even though my cousin didn't smoke weed, she used to drive us around while my brother and I would smoke. In our little town, about 10,000 people lived there at one time. There is a dirt road that runs next to the railroad tracks. They had 3 or 4 houses on it, and they were pretty far apart and heavily wooded. The road was about a mile long. We were driving, and we got about halfway down the road to the spot of the road with the largest distance between the nearest houses. By this time, it was about 9 p.m. We pulled over on the side of the road and light up a joint and start smoking. Mind you, my cousin doesn't smoke, so we're sitting there for about a half hour, just talking and bullshitting, when all of a sudden, this huge light, it's like a bright white light, appears about a quarter mile away, as if it was a train coming towards the tracks. After a few minutes, we noticed it wasn't getting any closer. We thought that maybe it was an odd figuring, or maybe it was a train headed our way down the tracks, but there were no train noises. The crossing gates near us never came down. Then, there wasn't really anything else. But slowly, but surely, the intensity and brightness of the light kept increasing, without it moving any closer. Then all of a sudden, we could hear a sound of wah 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 wah, until it turned into a constant, low humming noise. Next thing we know, the light was so bright and coming in every window from no apparent direction, as if it had swallowed us. We all glanced at each other, but didn't say anything. We weren't scared or freaking out. We were very calm and didn't feel threatened or endangered. But then the light was so bright and white, I couldn't see my brother in the backseat of the car. The duration of this light seemed to be several minutes. Eventually, the light disappeared. Not slowly, but as if someone had just flipped the light switch, it just disappeared. We once again all looked at each other without saying a word for several seconds. Then all three of us at the same exact moment said, "What the fuck was that?" in unison. My cousin started up his car, and I looked at the clock in his car and noticed that it was now 20 after midnight, which means over 3 hours had elapsed in what felt like only a few minutes of light. I've talked to my cousin and my brother about this for only a few moments since that night. I'm not a believer of UFOs or aliens, but that is definitely something that is unexplainable. I still think about it now and again, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Being a robotics engineer, that just is kind of my way of, getting through things. I believe everything can be explained logically, but still draw a blank on what happened this night. I'm a 20-year-old female, and I live in Michigan. I was 16 years old when these events happened. I am a huge athletic nerd, and I go hiking every day unless I feel lazy. I picked the wrong day to go one day, and I met and experienced something I will not want to experience again. I drove to the hiking trail I go to just about every time I go hiking, and this day, I saw a creepy guy to look like he would be in his 30s, but me being as stubborn and hard-headed as I was, I ignored my gut and went and started jogging on the trail. I took a short glance at him and started going on to the trail. I got about 200 to 300 yards away from the entrance and took a short break until I heard a scream from what sounded like a man. I looked down the path, which made my heart drop. I saw the guy running straight toward me as my adrenaline rushed into me. I started to rush as fast as I could. This guy was running so fast that he was catching up with me, and I was a really fast runner. This guy ran like he had taken 2 shots of steroids. As I started to cry and panic, I took a sharp turn into the woods and started to run back to the parking lot area. I kept hearing his footsteps not far behind me once again. As I kept running, the footsteps started to go slower as I was getting closer and closer to the parking lot. At last, I made it into the parking lot and cried tears of joy as I took out my cell phone and called the cops. Not so long after they arrived and searched, they found the man. He was a homeless 37-year-old man, and they said they found a butcher knife in one of his coat pockets. Till this day, I'm glad I did ROTC throughout high school, or else I would have had no way of getting out of that situation. To start things off, I am 14 years old, and this happened last year. At the time, my parents had split, so my dad moved into the Rockies in order to be closer to the sheriff's office where he works. He ended up finding a nice little place in the woods. A few weeks later, he ended up getting a Shiloh Shepherd, which is a dog that is a little smaller than my other German Shepherd but all black. He was severely neglected and was in horrible shape. He immediately attached to me and my dad and would follow us everywhere. He would even peek his head into the shower to make sure I didn't disappear. He was a very protective dog, which will be important later. Anyways, I decided to take both my dogs with me while I explore the surrounding forest. My current German Shepherd is very attentive and will bark but never actually bite, while Gunner is less attentive but barks like crazy and even bites people if they fake hit me. So, we were walking in the woods about a mile away from my home when I came across what used to be a house, but it looked like it was burned down, leaving nothing but a foundation and a chimney. Now, we were in the middle of the woods with no roads in sight, so this struck me as odd. Either this is a very old house, or I'm missing a road that must have been hidden. As I get closer to the house, I hear snorting, like a sound a bear makes. My German Shepherd, Thor, immediately locks onto a tree. I look, and there was a bear in the tree about 200 yards away. This immediately set off alarm bells in my head, because a bear that far away would have definitely ran away if it saw us. Something had to have scared it real bad for it to climb up into a tree. My other dog, Gunner, starts going ballistic at something to the left of the tree. Then I saw it, for only a split second, but I saw a hand slide back from the front of the tree. That split second was enough for Gunner to fly at the tree, and nothing. Complete silence. Gunner runs back to me with his tail in between his legs. Thor still scanning the air with his massive ears, but as my tunnel vision clears, I realize something. There is no house. There is no bear. We're at my house. I run inside and try to comprehend what the hell just happened. I'm still confused to this day what happened there. I tried to find the foundation and chimney many times and have found no luck. I even found my leashes that I apparently dropped, but there's no house. Anybody have an explanation for this? No, I was not high. I did end up with crusted hair from dry blood, as there was no cut to be found though, so I don't think I was hit. My dogs are fine and so am I, but I'm just confused. Really confused. The earliest encounter I can remember having with something unnatural, seems like the best word for it, was when I was little. I've lived on a farm in Texas that was about an hour away from the nearest town. We did have neighbors, but only two, and they weren't exactly nearby. We had some big animals on the farm, cows and bulls mainly, but nothing that was predatory besides the house cats and relatively small domesticated dogs we and our neighbors had. We lived in a farmhouse with higher than normal windows, as in case of a flood, and it did seem to flood a lot in the area. The windows were about 5 feet off the ground at the sill. I know that it wasn't just my lower perspective, because my mother has pictures from back then, and she's 5'3". She hasn't grown at all since then. Anyway, one night, I was sleeping in the living room. I used to do that as an excuse to play with my toys for longer, and I woke up absolutely terrified. The air felt weird and like it was charged with energy, and I remember trying to hide under my blankets before I even registered anything else that was happening. After what was probably only a few moments, I heard something big walking around outside. We had a wooden porch, and I could hear the sound of heavy paws and deep breathing coming from outside. As it was pacing, I peeked out from under my blankets at the window. That's when I saw what looked like an animal's back fur pass by the window. It looked almost like it was a hyena's shoulder fur bristles, not like any dog I had ever seen. Retrospectively, coming from the angle that I was at. I was hiding in the window. It had to be almost 5'5" at the shoulder for me to be able to see it like that. It spent the next, what felt like hours, but was likely no more than 1 or 2 minutes at most, pacing back and forth outside, breathing, sniffing, and occasionally growling quietly. This growl sounded if you would take a normal dog's growl and turn the pitch way down. It was almost all bass, and even when it was growling quietly, it felt like the noise was coming from almost right next to me, or from inside my head. Now, I know it sounds like it was just a wolf of some kind, but there aren't any wolves in that area. Literally, none of them. I've also come across wolves since then, and none of them feel like that thing did. It had kind of a pressure to it, almost like it distorted the world around it just by existing. I have no clue what it was, or why it even showed up at the first place. All I do know is that it was unnatural and wrong. I don't remember seeing any footprints or anything else the next morning, but if I did, no one else believed me. I also know that none of our cattle were hurt or gone, which honestly just disturbs me more. If it were hungry, then it would have tried to take or eat one of them. If they'd been spooked by whatever was getting close to them, then our neighbors would have woken up, and they didn't. Which means I can only assume that it was only interested in humans, or maybe just us specifically. I didn't see anything like that for years, and when I did, I wasn't even in America, so I doubt that it was the same one. But I guess you never know with these things. I apologize for the length. I can be a bit long-winded, but I will keep sending more experiences as I have the moment to spare. This event happened 3 years ago during mid-July. I live in Montana, outside of a rural community with a population of about 2,000. During this time, I lived in a small one-floor ranch home by myself. My nearest neighbor lived 1 mile away and was a farmer. Never had many strange encounters leading up to this one, but the woods by my house always had an ominous feel to it. Soon after moving in, I realized why the previous homeowners left pretty quickly. I'd start to hear noises in the woods. These weren't just any noises, but what sounded like blood-curdling screams and growls. After some research, I learned that even something like a raccoon or bobcat can make these unnatural noises, and chalked it up to it being that. But still, it just never felt right. It's hard to explain, but I never felt like this before. And it was just something about the woods around my house that made me uncomfortable. Like I was always being watched. The first experience I couldn't explain happened about 2 weeks after I moved in. There was a thunderstorm, and the thunder was loud enough to keep me awake. I never did feel comfortable in storms by myself. The lightning was crazy, and would light up the whole surrounding area for a fraction of a second. I was laying on the couch and got up to get a glass of drink at the sink. It was about 2 a.m. if I recall correctly. Above it, there's a small window that gives a view of my yard leading up to the tree line. When the next flash of lightning hit, I saw it. Admittedly, it wasn't a long view, but it gave me enough time to see whatever this thing was. It was near the tree line, just a few steps into my yard. At first I thought it was a bear, but it wasn't. It was standing on 2 legs with its face pointed towards the house. The legs were like a dog's, and I could clearly make out the hocks. It was hard to tell the color of the fur, but it was dark. Its upper body was massive, with a wide torso and arms, and could almost reach the ground from where it was standing. The strangest thing is how the upper body seemed to dwarf the lower body. After standing there frozen in shock, I waited for the next lightning strike, but when it happened, it wasn't there. It happened so quickly and was gone so quickly After that, I bought a gun and would sleep with it within arm's reach. The next encounter is what I consider the most frightening thing of my life. For several weeks, nothing worth noting happened. I don't get cable where I live, and one night I was watching something and my satellite kept acting up. I didn't like going outside at night, but this would be quick. I just have to move the antenna a little bit. Nothing had happened for weeks, so I decided just to go out and do it. I grabbed my gun and flashlight and went out. The first thing I noticed was the eerie quietness that surrounded this time of year. The woods are quite active with all types of creatures this time of year as well, but not tonight. Despite the fear I was developing, I made my way over to the satellite and began to adjust it. I heard a small snap of a stick and quickly turned to my left and shined the light towards the direction of the noise. What I saw will horrify me for the rest of my life. I was immediately met with red eyes. These eyes were the color of blood and they were evil. The head of this thing looked like a mutated German shepherd. I don't like to say it, but it looked like a werewolf. A long snout and pointed ears. The fur was black and shaggy in some places. I could see this creature's extremely developed musculature, and it dwarfed even the biggest humans on Earth. It was half and half out of the woods, almost crouching. It still came up to my head at 6 feet. Fully standing, this thing would have easily been 8 feet. But I was about 20 feet from this thing. I didn't even consider my gun, which I thought would protect me. Chances are, in hindsight, the little 223 bullets would have just pissed this thing off before it tore me to shreds. I backed away slowly, never breaking eye contact with it. I gently picked up my gun and my fight or flight reflexes kicked in. I chose flight. Maybe not the best option, but even if I stayed there, this thing would have easily killed me. I ran the fastest I have ever ran in my life and didn't turn back once. I have no idea if it was pursuing me. I got in the house, locked every door, window, covered the blinds and sat with my back against the wall, cradling the gun the entire night. I didn't get a wink of sleep that night, and very few the following days. To make a long story short, I don't live there anymore. People often talk of Sasquatch being heinous and harmonious with nature and living within the ecosystem. Sure, if you see one it might be scary, but it's probably more awe than anything. With this thing, it was totally different. It felt unnatural. It was sinister. It felt evil. It was stalking me, toying with me, and I believe it would have killed me. I've never seen nor experienced this feeling again in my life. It is a memory I try to push past me, but I still get nightmares about it. I think until the day I die, I will always have the image burned into my memory. I'm 26 now, and living in Pennsylvania. But when I was younger, I lived in Montpelier, Vermont. My summers were spent hiking mountains, swimming in lakes, and exploring expansive forests. I knew that my state had bears and rattlesnakes in its more secluded, mountainous regions, but I never imagined that there was anything more terrifying than those out there. When I was 19, my friend Emily and I went to Moss Glen Falls for a day of swimming and picnicking. It gave us a nice change of scenery from campus. The waterfall is located in Stowe, which is a remote town in Vermont that has a population of barely 4,000. Emily was from another state and had never really seen much of the area beyond our college campus, so I figured showing her some of Vermont's quaint locations was in order. The day was perfect. We had packed plenty of food, sunscreen, and towels. and since it was a weekday afternoon, there was no one else at the falls except for the elderly couple that we passed, but they left shortly after we got there. We spread our towels out on a large rock by the falls and alternated between climbing up the waterfall edges to get to the swimming pools and relaxing in the late afternoon sun. It was peaceful, and it was a perfect break after a long day of homework and classes. As the day wore on, Emily wanted to explore some of the trails near the falls. I was familiar with a few of them, and tried to keep her on those. What I didn't account for was that she would insist on exploring some of the more outlying trails, and that we would consequently get lost. We spent nearly an hour walking in circles, our arms and legs getting covered in mosquito bites, and our bathing suits drying uncomfortably onto our skin. We had the flashlights on our phones to give us a little light source once the sun set, but they didn't do much to illuminate the dense undergrowth shrouding both sides of the trail. Finally, we came across a blackberry patch that we were pretty sure we had seen earlier, so by logical default, we started heading down the path closest to the bushes. Emily kept asking me if she heard twigs snapping near us. I brushed it off as a city girl being scared of deer or rabbits. I didn't hear anything myself, so I figured she was feeling paranoid due to it being her first time lost in the woods. Then I heard it. The noise came from somewhere behind us, and it was too loud to be a small animal like a rabbit. I figured it was another person out walking, or maybe a herd of deer passing through. Stowe has never been a populous town, and the locals could argue that there's more deer than people in the area. I ignored the uneasy feeling building in the pit of my stomach and kept walking, chalking it up to my friend's paranoia rubbing off on me, and I babbled senselessly about cute guys to keep Emily and I distracted. After another 10 minutes of walking, we finally came in sight of the trailhead. There was a large boulder with a plaque on it dedicated to a young woman who had been murdered at the falls back in 1991, and right beyond that was my car. As we neared the boulder, relief evident on Emily's face, a weird noise came from the woods behind us. It sounded almost like a cat, but it was distorted and static, like it was coming out of an old radio. My first instinct was that the cat was wounded or in danger. I've always been an animal lover, and if there was a hurt cat, I wasn't about to leave it and let it become a coyote snack. I turned around, ignoring the feeling, and Emily begging me to stay. I peered back into the trail opening. I gave Emily the keys and told her to get our towels. Now that we knew where we were, and I promised that I'd be back momentarily. If I couldn't find the cat right away, I wasn't going to spend forever looking for it, but I couldn't just drive away either. With the loss of the second flashlight, the woods seemed a bit more eerie to me, and the darkness was nagging at my peripheral vision. I walked a little ways down the path as I called to the cat, hoping to locate it by its meow, but I didn't hear anything for several moments. I was about to give up when I heard a low, out-of-place laugh behind me. I spun around, my heart beating too fast, but all I saw was a large buck. I remember muttering something about being stupid, sneaky deer or something like that. Then I headed back to the trailhead. That was when the deer laughed again, and I froze. The harsh sound was completely unnatural. For those of you who do not know, deer make sounds like grunts, bleats, and snorts. They don't make any sort of laughter-like noises. Even if they did, it wouldn't have had the same cadence as a human's laugh would. And as this deer's did, this situation was weird and unnerving, and I kept hoping that someone would pop their head out from behind the tree and tell me it was a prank. But that didn't happen. The deer took a few steps behind me, and then the odd cat sound came from it. I almost literally threw my hands up in a nope gesture, and I started walking away from it as quickly as I could. I was almost in sight of the end of the trail when I felt something snag my hair. I swatted it away, thinking it was a branch, since there were a lot of low-hanging trees along the trail. But the sensation returned instantly. I reached up to tug my hair free, but it wouldn't come loose. I turned to face the offending tree, my heart thumping in shock. The deer, now on its hind legs, had my hair caught on one of its antlers. The snarls from a day of swimming and hiking were entangled around its antlers, and I could feel its cold breath on my face. It was not warm, it was not hot, but icy cold breath rafted around me. I let out the most shrill scream I had ever heard myself make, and I violently yanked my hair off its antlers. I sprinted for my car, screaming the whole way for Emily to start it. I heard the engine turn when I neared the boulder, and she didn't hesitate to floor it as soon as I was in the car. The tears streaming down my face were enough motivation. She didn't question me until we were nearly 5 minutes from Moss Glen. I told her about the weird noises and the deer getting up in my face. I told her it startled me, and that, on top of the stress of being lost, it was just making me panic. She bought my explanation, agreeing that we were both super tired, and added that my mind was probably playing tricks on me. I haven't returned to Stowe since then, even though I visited Vermont recently. I know there's probably some sort of rational explanation for what I saw and heard that night, but I haven't been able to find what that would be. This happened in 1987. I had some free time and decided to visit a place on Florida Mountain that I used to camp when I was a kid. I found it after driving a few times as the road was overgrown and hidden from the road. We used to camp on Old Logging Road. I crossed the stream and started following it. I noticed off to the left a fairly small bridge crossing over a stream, so I decided to follow the trail. It led to a clearing in the woods that became very eerie. The area had a small building that had strange astrological signs or something cut into the wood on them. It's pretty dense woods, and there's a very quiet, so you could definitely hear everything, and I could just feel like I shouldn't be there. As I looked around, I came across a large wood chopping block in the center of a clearing, and what appeared to be bloodstains in the middle of it. That immediately made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. All I could think was that this was a devil-worshipping area or some occult location. At this point, I knew it was best to leave quickly, as this was definitely the setup of every horror movie I've ever seen. And this was way back before cell phones, although there is no service they provide for modern comfort. Fast forward about 25 years later, I wanted to revisit the area. I took a drive on a Sunday and found the location. It looked like they had added much more substantial structures. One was covered, and it looked like a platform. It was raised as if it was for someone to speak on. I never felt comfortable there, and a chill was always present. The large chopping block was still there, and it appeared that no one had been there for months. But I knew I should get out of there, because there's no telling what or whom would come back. It's been 5 years since then, but I plan to visit when I feel like an adventure. My father is a locomotive engineer. He ran freight trains from Chicago to southern Wisconsin. This story happened just north of Illinois in the Wisconsin border. Being young, I always liked listening to his stories about what he saw that day on the engine. There's plenty of weird things you see as an engineer. Coyotes, cougars, homeless people, etc. But one time, he came home from work and explained to me that he saw something he couldn't comprehend. It was a cold, rainy evening late October. There are some stretches of the tracks that go through forest with no signs of civilizations in sight. And that where he saw something tall standing on the tracks. The proportions weren't right. The arms were just way too long. The head was large and flat with no neck. It was covered with wet, matted down brown fur. I got a really good look at it with the engine's light shining directly on it, he said. The engine encroached towards the creature, but it looked frozen, like it did not know what to do or where to go. About 15 feet away from hitting the thing, it cleared at least 15 foot of a ballast ditch in 2 steps back in the thick brush. My father was paralyzed. He didn't know what to do. He didn't feel safe even in the cab of the engine. It could have easily jumped onto the engine, but that was the first and last time that he saw what he believed to be a Bigfoot in the middle of nowhere. I recently arrived to my first duty station in Gulfport, Mississippi. I had a couple of friends who were arriving in a couple weeks. We were all planning on going camping once we all arrived. My friend and I wanted to scout some trails and find a big enough area that would fit all of us, about 5 people. My friend, let's call him H, called me late one day and said he found a trail in the De Soto National Forest. I packed a couple snacks and my Gerber knife in my backpack. I picked H up and set off to find this trail. 45 minutes later, we pulled to the side of the road where this trail was and started off into the woods. It was late, probably about 5 o'clock, and the sun was setting when we found a good spot. We decided to head back. Something just felt off though. There wasn't a sound. No birds, no frogs, nothing. Just dead silence. We decided to pick up the pace. At this point, the sun went completely down and it was pitch dark. We were about 100 meters from the truck when we heard rustling behind us. We stopped and looked behind us. We couldn't quite see anything because it was just so dark. But that's when we heard this deep, guttural ape-like howl, like an angry gorilla. We didn't think twice about it, booking it towards the truck. We hopped in and peeled out of there like a bat out of hell. We never saw it, but that howl scared the living hell out of me. I've never felt fear like that before, and I've never felt it like that since. That camping trip never happened, and you can bet your ass that I don't even go out there much anymore.